Hey everyone. Today we'll be discussing social changes and political, social, and economic revolutions in North and South America. A small disclaimer before we begin. My biggest regret of high school and college is doing the bare minimum when it came to the language requirements. As a result, I would like to apologize in advance for not even if, but when I mispronounce something that everybody else knows how it should be said. It was a big mistake and I can't change it, but I'm learning. I'm trying. All that I ask is you either contain your laughter or get it out of your system before you come into class. Thank you for your cooperation. And now we're going to dive in and we'll talk about the independence in Latin America, 1800 to 1830. The roots of the revolution can be traced to wealthy colonial residents of Latin America. They're frustrated by the political and economic power of colonial officials and angered by high taxes and imperial monopolies. Events in Europe ultimately caused a crisis of legitimacy that led to the colonial revolutions in Latin America. Basically, everything Napoleon did. The Portuguese royal family fled to Brazil, again because of Napoleon, where King John maintained his court for over a decade. Juntas, which are a governing body, claimed authority over Spanish colonies, and they wrote the first constitution, really just biding time until Napoleon was crushed. Napoleon's invasion of Portugal and Spain in 1807 and 1808 led dissenters in Venezuela, Mexico, and Bolivia to overthrow Spanish colonial officials in 1808 and 1809. The Spanish authorities quickly reasserted control, but this would lead to a new round of revolutions beginning in 1810. And as you can see, the French conquest by 1807, everything in light gray. And then you have the Spanish and Portuguese South America, but you can also see where other European powers have a little bit of influence. In Spanish South America, the movements toward independence were tied to the events of Napoleonic Europe. Venezuela's junta, again the governing body, saw itself as a temporary holding power until the restoration of the Spanish monarchy. And as we know, in 1815, Napoleon was defeated and the Spanish monarchy was restored. However, a Creole-led revolutionary junta declared independence in Venezuela in 1811. Spanish authorities were able to rally free blacks and slaves to defend the Spanish Empire because the junta's leaders were interested primarily in pursuing the interests of Creole landholders. So basically, what's going on here is you have the governing body who is only interested in looking out for the Creoles, that would be the Europeans who were born in the Americas, and trying to get rid of the Peninsulares, those European-born Europeans. But then you have Simon Bolivar. He emerges as the leader of the Venezuelan revolutionaries, and Bolivar was a student of the Enlightenment. Again, guys, the Enlightenment. Just think about that trend. We keep seeing it again and again when it comes to revolutions. Bolivar was a student of the Enlightenment, and he used the force of his personality and the promise of emancipation to attract new allies. And this actually included slaves and free blacks, the former allies of the Spanish. Once he got these people to join his cause, he was able to command the loyalty of his troops. And Bolivar, what you have to know, was from one of the richest households in Venezuela. He traveled to Spain at 16 to visit his family, and at age 20 he returned to Europe. He was inspired by the American and French revolutions. Bolivar returned to Caracas in 1813 at the head of an army of liberation. In 1819, a Congress of Angostura was planned. And during this session, a revived Venezuelan republic was planned out and established. On December 17th, 1819, the fundamental law of the Republic of Colombia was enacted by the congressman of the city. And today, Angostura is called Ciudad Bolivar, or City of Bolivar. It consisted on 14 articles in which the Republic of Gran Colombia established its political structure. And it considered the fact that the provinces of Venezuela and New Granada were united in a single republic. And they could not stand if divided into different nations, even if they had close ties. So the idea of Gran Colombia was created to look out for the mutual interests of all nations and people involved. Bolivar defeated the Spanish armies in 1824, and he tried to forge Venezuela, Colombia, and Ecuador into a single nation. But this project was a failure, and Bolivar's other attempts to create a confederation of former Spanish colonies also failed. So long story short, his plan for United Gran Colombia failed before he died, and Jose Antonio Paez became president of Venezuela. But in the 1860s, Venezuela would undergo a civil war. Buenos Aires was another important center of revolutionary activity in Spanish South America. In 1816, 2 years after Ferdinand regained the Spanish throne, local junta leaders declared independence as the United Provinces of Rio de la Plata. The viceroyalty was established in 1776 of Rio de la Plata from several former viceroyalty of Peru dependencies that mainly extended over the Rio de la Plata basin. And that's roughly present-day territories of Argentina, Bolivia, Paraguay, and Uruguay, extending inland from the Atlantic coast. And Buenos Aires was located on the western shore of the Rio de la Plata, and it was chosen as the new capital. The new government was weak, and the region quickly descended into a political chaos. So as you can see, United Provinces of Rio de la Plata, and then we have Gran Colombia. Moving on to Mexico. In 1810, Mexico was Spain's richest and most populous colony, but the Amerindian population of central Mexico had suffered from dislocation due to mining and commercial enterprises, as well as a cycle of crop failures and epidemics. Unlike in Venezuela, where independence began with the Creoles, in Mexico it began with an uprising of mestizos and Amerindians. Father Miguel de Hidalgo rallied the poor for Mexican independence and in the name of justice for the oppressed. And his rallying begins with what's called the Cry of Dolores. This is within the city of Dolores, where you have the first movement for independence. On September 16th, 1810, Hidalgo urged the people to rise up against the Spanish authorities, and the resulting violent rebellion took place under the leadership of Hidalgo. His uprising upset both the Spanish and Creole elites, and unfortunately, the uprising didn't work, and Hidalgo ends up being executed after he's excommunicated. However, his uprising is still celebrated today on September 16th, which is Mexico's National Day or Independence Day. After Hidalgo's capture and execution, under Jose Maria Morelos, loyalist forces defeated the insurrection, and Morelos was executed in 1815. In 1821, news of a military revolt in Spain inspired Colonel Agustin de Iturbide to declare Mexico's independence, with himself as emperor. In early 1823, the army overthrew Iturbide and Mexico became a republic. In Brazil, in 1808, Napoleon invaded Portugal, as you guys know, and the royal family had to flee to Brazil. King John VI of Portugal ruled his kingdom from Brazil until 1821, when unrest in Spain and Portugal led him to return to Lisbon. King John's son Pedro remained in Brazil, where he ruled as regent until 1822. Pedro recognized that the people of Brazil were moving to independence, and that's when he declared Brazil to be an independent constitutional monarchy with himself as king. In 1835, the largest urban slave uprising in the Americas occurred in Brazil, and it was known as the Male Revolt, or the Muslim Uprising, and it is perhaps the most significant slave rebellion in Brazil. On a Sunday during Ramadan in January 1835, in the city of Salvador de Bahia, a small group of black slaves and freedmen who were inspired by Muslim teachers rose up against the government. The slaves had known about the Haitian Revolution, and they wore necklaces bearing the image of President Dessalines, who had declared Haitian independence. Jamaica was the scene of another slave uprising in 1831 to 1832, known as the Christmas Rebellion. So we slowly have different locations rising up and attempting freedom Pedro's liberal policies included opposition to slavery, and that alienated the political slaveholding elite because they depended on slave labor for their plantations. He incurred heavy losses of men and money as he attempted to control Uruguay by military force. Street demonstration and violence led Pedro I to abdicate in favor of his son, Pedro II, who reigned until Republicans overthrew him in 1889. Unlike the rest of South America, Brazil gained independence as a constitutional monarchy. Much like Mexico, Brazil was also plagued by tensions between liberal reformers and conservatives. A large part of the Brazilian economy was based on coffee plantations, and Brazil also exported a lot of rubber. As with much of South America, the Brazilian economy remained dependent on exporting raw materials and importing industrial goods. As more cheap labor immigrated to Brazil, and we'll talk about why later, slavery would become less necessary. We'll stop there for today. I do suggest that you review your notes, make sure that you've captured the key points of revolutions in Brazil, Mexico, and Spanish South America. And if you have any questions, shoot me an email. Have a great day, guys. Cheers.